sort of create a situation where violence becomes, because it has become the language of engaging with the state, a viable proposition. I think for me, the last two ones relate to something that the former Deputy Minister touched on, which is around labor market regulation. And I've had the fortune of being part of the national minimum wage process in South Africa, and to have seen how that one lever can be used to ensure that within firms, for those who are already in employment, who are part of the precariously employed and who are part of what we call the working poor, how important a lever it is to ensure that you not only regulate income at the bottom end of the distribution, but you also undertake and you take some steps to implement policy that is able to regulate incomes at the top of the income distribution. Then lastly, I think we are in the 21st century. The fourth industrial revolution is something that is not only imminent, but it's already here. And I think we do need large-scale investment, publicly and also driven by the private sector, into ICTs that will ensure that we don't use digital to further entrench the divides that are already there in our society. It's great to see that some of the initiatives, such as, for instance, Project Isizwe, that are being driven from a municipal level in order to broaden access to the digital and the knowledge economy, are beginning to entrench themselves and make some strides. And I think, of course, as I speak about all of these investments, which I think should be part and parcel of whatever social compact there is between different stakeholders in society, we need to ensure that we build such compacts at a national level and also at a regional level. And I think the question of regional where we can't even plan and foresee into the foreseeable future how we can actually plan around the resources that we have. And by principle, this needs to move away from some form of narrow accumulation by an elite for the entrenchment of whatever personal or patronage-driven alliances, and even some of the geopolitical alliances that are sometimes used as a muse to say we are undertaking a particular path, which is not necessarily in the interest of people, but is couched under some form of sort of geopolitical explanation or some form of justification.
The state capacity and also the credibility of our governments, because that is very, very important. I'll just give you my experience, my own country, when we moved from one-party state to multi-party democracy. One of the things that we embarked upon was to put structures to support the democratic institution which we created. For instance, the issue of the Law Commission, the Human Rights Commission, the Anti-Corruption Bureau, Office of the Ombudsman, the Independent Electoral Commission, the Independent Judiciary, and the list goes on. But also we allowed a number of civil society organizations which were not there, before. We, first of all, looked at education as a very important factor. We said we had to educate our population. In those days, the number of children who were going in primary schools were only 1.9 million children registered in primary schools, which was not enough, a population of 17 million. So we introduced free primary education. We said education is very important. It's a key for national development, a key for poverty alleviation, a key for anything that you can talk about. And the numbers of children moved from 1.9 million children who used to go to school at that time to about 3-4 million children in 1994. This was really a revolution, I may call it. I remember my Minister of Education coming to me and said, Mr. President, what do I do? Where do I get classrooms? I said, that's your job, it's not my job. Where do I get teachers? I said, that's your responsibility. Let's find a way how we can employ teachers and all that, and all that. Now, I'm mentioning this because the issue of poverty is a problem on our continent. We have to do something about it. The challenge we have, I think the population growth is a factor. It's also having to eat our resources, the little resources we have.
We're discussing, as you see, is moving towards inclusiveness. That's how it's written in the program. I agree with President Muluzi that Mcebisi dealt with a lot of the issues that we need to deal with. But I would start with saying, surely in terms of moving towards that inclusiveness, the first objective surely must be to ensure that everybody is involved in meaningful economic activity. Not inclusiveness starting somewhere else, but in the sense of actual engagement in useful economic activity. Included in that meaningful economic activity. We discussed this question, the continent, and understood exactly this point. The bulk, 70%, 75% of your African population is in the rural areas. And that includes even a bigger percentage of women being in the rural areas. So if you want to make a movement in terms of inclusivity in economic activity, your rural areas become critical. I'm saying even in the context of addressing the issue of women's empowerment, gender, women's emancipation, what happens to the rural women becomes critical. So I'm saying the continent discussed this. And we decided, the chair of the conference, Togo Tidizade, will remember this in better detail than I would. He decided on what was called the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Plan, CAADP. And it is actually a comprehensive African agricultural development plan, comprehensive. deals with every element of this. Whether you are talking about provision of seeds or infrastructure, processing, agro-processing, and all of these issues. I'm saying in a meaningful manner. So for not just to say, you can't say, it's okay, let these Africans continue to be involved in subsistence agriculture. You got to say, no, that's not acceptable. You've got to raise the level of engagement in terms of agriculture. So I'm saying that the first step in terms of looking at this inclusiveness. Mm-hmm. Then you come to this question. Then you say, we've got an urban population. How do you address the matter of the inclusion of that urban population in meaningful economic activity? And this issue is correctly raised about the informal sector. So I'm saying that's where I would start with this matter. And each in a question to any one of those issues is challenging. How do you ensure the inclusion in meaningful economic activity of the youth? And your interventions might very well be different as between the rural youth and the urban youth. Mm-hmm. They may very well be different in certain elements. How do you deal with this matter with regard to women? I hope you are with me.
Yes, we are all with the President, yes?
Before we get to matters of redistribution of anything.
Right.
And you see, it means training programs, for instance. People who are in the informal sector in the urban areas. And the point that was raised by Mcebisi originally, which President Phakile Muluzi has just confirmed, is that very important, because it's obvious that to achieve these things I'm talking about, you need a strong state. But I think in addition to a strong state, you need a progressive leadership. I don't think it's any leadership that is going to do these things. It's a progressive leadership that has got a sense of, we serve the people of our country. If you've got a leadership which says we serve me, they're not going to do any of these things. So I'm saying we can start there. And so I don't want to continue further because you are going to stop me.
Thank you, thank you. I do want... But banks are not passing on the capacity building and even the funding that they are getting, honestly, to the people who need it the most. And I'm openly saying enough is enough. And I hope that more people in this room...
Why are the governments allowing it?
Why are governments allowing it? Good. So yes, I'll start with the gentleman at the back over there, please. Where is the mic? And then come to the gentleman at the front. Yes.
Very much delighted to hear extremely interesting and moving ideas, particularly on inclusiveness, as exclusiveness is structural violence in most of the cases in African conflict. So I would definitely submit to that one. When we come back to the very idea of inclusiveness, I think we need to define it operationally, what we mean by that inclusiveness. Political inclusiveness, economic, and of course there are many other types of inclusiveness. And at the same time, I, with love and respect to the senior citizen earlier mentioned, you can't eat democracy or human rights. I think man does not live by bread alone. Right. Also, they need democracy and human rights as well. Yes. To be honest, so as to promote inclusiveness, we must have that understanding which goes beyond the here and now, the development. Education. Some education could be poisoning, to be honest with you here. That's why someone said, let the French and the German change their history textbook, then they can read what each other say about the other one. So I think that's also very
And if you actually look at much of the infrastructure, not the new infrastructure, the old infrastructure was always intended to remove our resources. That's how it was all set up. Very briefly, sir, and then I'll take two more. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Vusi Adin.
If we bring it forward, I'll give these two gentlemen just a few. Oh, there's a gentleman here who has not spoken. Can we have the mic here as quickly as possible? Young lady with energy, yes. Thank you. Keep coming. Oh, somebody's there. Thank you. Thank you.
Barakanyan is my name. Just one brief question is especially to Jonas Mcebisi and His Excellency Thabo Mbeki. My question is, when the people join the long queues during the elections, their expectations is very simple. Their total transformation of their
One thing that we have not been able to do quite effectively, and I will talk about South Africa, President in particular, it's actually that we have not been able to break the trajectory of our economy historically. We still essentially, despite all the developments that we have, and many African countries are going through the same, we're still over-dependent on commodity trade and commodity cycles, etc., etc. So part of I think, the new thinking that we need to do is, why have we not been able to transform? Why have you not been able to ensure that there's a scaled up manufacturing and value-adding activities of our minerals? And in part, I think, and if you look at it, that some of the challenges we face now are precisely arising from the fact that we have been over-dependent on commodity cycles and etc. So there are 2 points I wanted to make in regard to this thing. The first is that without a very active industrial policy that seeks to identify areas where we have the comparative advantage, build skills and capability around those, and to add value in those areas, we are not going to be able to get out of where we are. So there's a new thinking that we need to do around industrial policy, etc., etc. But I want to come back to the point. To drive an active industrial policy, you also need a very strong and effective state. And quite frankly, if you look at, I think again, talking to our experience, if you look at our interventions in that area of industrial support, industrial planning, etc., we've been pretty weak by and large, as it were. So I'm saying that's the first point. The second point, I think, is looking at the new technologies, the new areas of development, etc. If you take, for instance, I mean, what we've done very well, I think, if you look at how we've grown the renewable energy sector, we also need to kind of look at alternative sectors like renewable energy and, of course, different other things, and ICT as was mentioned.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. I really want to respond to my colleague there who raised a question on this one. I think he misunderstood me. I come from a background where I fought for human rights and democracy. During the one-party state dictatorship in Malawi, I was put in prison 7 times because for fighting for democracy in my country. So I'm an advocate for human rights. What I said was, having moved from one-party dictatorship to democracy, we had to put structures to support the democratic dispensation. For instance, the Law Commission, the Human Rights, and all those institutions. The Anti-Corruption Bureau, we put all these institutions. But we sat down as a government, we said, but this may not be enough. We need to create something better. Well, human rights is better, but people have to be given something, create employment. We have to give them clean water to drink. President Mbeki talked about 75% of our people live in the rural areas. What could we do? So we introduced poverty alleviation program as a program. I remember having asked my Minister of Finance, then I said, bring me a 1-page paper. How do you reduce poverty? How do you do it? My mother lives in the rural area. How can she feel that in actually, she's enjoying that as a part of the government and all that? Can she get clean water? Can she get a school where her grandchildren can go? All these things are important. But I did not say that human rights is not important. Democracy, I said very, very important. It's fundamental. You cannot replace human rights. You cannot replace democracy. Those are fundamental issues. That's why I was talking about the state capacity in terms of credibility. The issue of corruption, for instance, which is in Africa. How do we address this? So I thought I should just answer that question very clearly.
Let me assist you as well a little bit.
I have to say that my focus is, maybe I'm a bit ahead of the discussion because I'm more concerned about sources of resources and management of those resources, because we do have resources. For instance, I believe that we should get the banks to do what they need to do. But you already have resources within the state. They are in the control of the state. You've got assets, you've got capital, you've got all of that. And my view is that I don't think we are taking advantage of that. These are our state-owned entities. And secondly, I think one believes that these resources, once they are made available, you will deal with all from rural, women to, all the poor from. Actually, a very touching statistics that worried me a few days ago was when the statistician general said, young people, little kids are poor, but when they grow, they become unemployed. That's a huge problem. The question is, how do you deal with it? I don't think the bank at this stage will be your solution necessarily. We need them. They need to come on board, and there are structures within government that are dealing with it. But I think state-owned entities have a critical role to play, and we need to bring them on board. And I don't think we've been able to do that. One of the key issues is exactly what Mr. Jonas raised. It's the quality of leadership. And I'm afraid going forward, there is no hope that South Africa is likely to have any better leadership. I'm afraid to say that. And the reason for that is that when you look at what we are dealing with at the present moment, it tells you this is a precursor for what is likely to happen going forward. So the question is, and I'm talking technically, I don't want to go into the politics of this discourse, but I'm just saying technically, you don't have a leadership that can deal with it.
You're now saying suppose something needs to change. Something
has to change. The other thing is that why do you continue regurgitating the problem? We know what the problem is.
Regulation is as a lever to ensure that you create or you undo a very exclusive economic structure. And I think if you look at descriptions of the South African economic structure, some have called it a minerals energy complex. Increasingly, some are calling it a minerals energy finance complex. And I think it touched on the financialization. But one of the other things that is an unintended outcome of financialization is, the predatory use of the term of financial inclusion. We saw it, for instance, here in South Africa, where the fiscal transfers that are part of the fiscal distribution we were talking about were actually used because it was outsourced to a private entity, were used to add on and on-sell other elements. So you would go and collect a grant, but other things would be marketed to you. You would have loans that were marketed to you. You would have airtime and a range of other things that are marketed to you. So I think we must move away from this thing that says all attempts at financial inclusion are altruistic by nature. I think a big part of it is also subject to the commercial and at times predatory instincts of finance capital. And I think we also need to be aware of that. The other dimension I'd like to touch on is around this question of learning. And I think any key feature for me of any industrial policy that has succeeded across the globe has been in its ability to understand how you learn from an industrial perspective. And a big part of that, I think now where we are, with the tools that we have at our disposal through technology, is saying how do you ensure that you are able to link the resource endowment that we have to key industrial value chains that you would like to be part and parcel of. For instance, it doesn't make sense that the platinum reserves that Zimbabwe and South Africa sit on don't necessarily lead to some form of industrial strategy that's able to package key learnings, especially in the catalytic converter space, for instance, and be able to then have some form of stranglehold on that value chain in particular. And it might apply to many other value chains, and I think that's where, for me, the industrial policy conversation needs to go. But a big part of that also requires regulation that is able to understand the comparative advantage and also be able to encourage and ensure learning.
Thank you. Before I come to President Thabo Mbeki, President Muluzi wants to...
Yes. You know, SADC and all that, to talk about where is the leadership going to come from? I have, during my time, talked to a number of people, intellectuals, professors, and come and join politics. Oh, no. It's data politics. No, it's data game. So where are you going to get the people? I'm talking about you, ladies and gentlemen, who are professionals. Join politics. It may not be that data that you think. But it's something because we keep on criticizing and yet you're not available to make yourself available and say, look, it's the truth. I met a professor from the university 2 weeks ago. He came to interview on something else. I think he was talking about democracy. So I said, oh, by the way, you are retiring in 2 years' time. Would you like to join politics? Oh, no. I'd rather do something else. Right. Where is the leadership going to come from?
Where is the leadership going to come from? Get in the mud. It is muddy. Get in the Somebody asked, it's not rocket science, you know?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to say that I was trying very hard not to be philosophical, but to be as practical as possible in approaching this question, the question that has been put of moving towards inclusiveness. And it was described in the booklet even on it is discussing economic inclusivity, not the political. The political is the next session. It's coming just now. So we're talking around economic questions. Now, the second thing I'd like to say, I don't want to discuss South Africa. We are discussing Africa here. So don't drag me into South Africa. That's a different topic. We are talking about an African challenge. What do we do about it so that it helps to produce the outcomes that we want? And that's an important question. We have no time to discuss it today. And I think, just to finish, moderate, you see, as I was saying, let's discuss these things as practically as possible. For instance, we talk about beneficiation, raw materials and so on. We were talking about this question with the Deputy Prime Minister of Namibia over lunch. And I was saying to her, I listened to the Zimbabweans, our neighbors, talking in the past about beneficiation of platinum. We must add value to this platinum. We can't just be exporting. It's a lovely wish, but I knew it could not be done. And the reason it couldn't be done is because Zimbabwe is not producing enough electricity. Smelters need lots of electricity. So you might want to add value to your platinum. It's a very, very good idea. But is it doable? Can't. They couldn't do it. You've got this famous platinum aluminum smelter in Maputo, the Mozal. Very successful. Because Mozambique was not generating enough electricity to process that smelter. So we can make a slogan to say, beneficiate. But when I'm saying you come to the practicals now to produce the actual beneficiation, you come across the constraints. And then you got to answer the constraints. What do you do in order to overcome this constraint? And I'm saying, a critical challenge for us here is what's our response to the capitalist system as it operates on the continent to ensure that it does not produce these negatives. But we don't have time to discuss that. But I think it's an important challenge. No. Thanks.
And we are taking a tea break. 15-minute tea break if we could.